Please be seated. Every so often, I get a message from a friend, or maybe even my phone itself telling me that they couldn't leave me a voice message because my voice mailbox was full. I've never admitted this before, and I suspect that I'm not the only one who has that scenario. My inbox gets full because there are a whole host of saved messages from my family members that I love. Messages from my mom, my brother, Willow, even Aiden, now that he has a phone. There's nothing particularly important in these messages. In fact, most of them I've never listened to. Instead, I saw that they called, and I just called them back. So why do I keep them? You know. Deep down, you know why I keep them. I don't need to tell you. In fact, I suspect that many of you might have a similar practice, to save those messages because you want to keep the voice of your loved ones near, even if they're gone. I keep these messages because one day my mom or my wife, my brother or my son might not be able to call me anymore. I've never really admitted that to anyone except the 8 o'clock service. Sorry. It's rarely the kind of thing that we like to admit to ourselves or to tell anyone about. It's dark, it's dreary, it admits death. And yet this is the time of year when the veil between our world and the next world grows awfully thin. It's a time when our hearts churn in anticipation and nostalgia. For millennia, and probably as long as humans have roamed the world, we've always combined this autumnal harvest time of abundance with an otherworldly fascination with our ancestors and our loved ones who are no longer with us. The ancient Celts in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales celebrated an ancient feast at the end of October, the beginning of November, called Samhain. It was a time, they believed, where that veil between this world and the invisible other world was thin, and they could peer through and could communicate with their ancestors, and they made offerings of food out of the abundance of the harvest. As Christianity came into contact with Samhain and the Celts, it discovered a way to commemorate all of its faithful ancestors too, and All Hallows Day, or All Saints' Day, was born. So here we are on All Saints' Sunday, and it feels like a holy time to talk about love and loss, life and death. I don't know if you've noticed, but despite the nearly insatiable appetite for graphic images of violence and death in our television, movies, and video games and news, we have a difficult time talking about death. You know, the common, everyday, garden variety death, which awaits us all, our loved ones and ourselves. And so hospitals, for instance, routinely refuse to admit their patients die, and instead they expire. Similarly, the Air Force does not report the deaths of its pilots who crash in combat or training, but rather relates that some pilots experienced uncontrolled landings into terrain. Generals do not record how many of the soldiers died, but rather the number of casualties their units suffered. We simply don't want to talk about death, maybe except on Halloween, which is, of course, the whole point of Halloween, to play act and to perform our fears with the hope of gaining control over them. It's one of the few times that we openly talk about death. Unfortunately, we miss out in all the pageantry, the real opportunity to face it. And in this light, this festival we celebrate today, All Saints' Day, appears such an odd affair. For in stark contrast to our culture which worships youth and boasts that you can have it All Saints lifts up the stark reality of our mortality by celebrating all those who have died, not those who have expired or passed away or been lost like a favorite pair of gloves, but rather those who have died in the faith. And we'll soon remember all their names, those who died over the last year as we read them during the Eucharistic prayer. and will celebrate their passing into the nearer presence of God. In so doing, we will face death solemnly and honestly, just as Jesus does in today's gospel. For in this odd little story about mummies and stinking, rotting flesh, we have a story that fits the polarities of Halloween and All Saints' Day perfectly. It has the flair of Halloween, but presents death soberly with an All Saints sensibility. In it, we see that death is real. It is harsh and it's scary. When Jesus encounters his friends, Mary and Martha, in grief, the text tells us that Jesus joins them. The text says, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. But this translation is too weak, both for the reality of death and for the Greek text itself. The first verb has a connection to anger. It's not simply a strong feeling, but it's more of a passion and a pain that comes from the anger at the situation. The root of the second verb is tied to the stirring up of one's insides. And it can be used in a physical sense of kind of stirring water, disturbing the calmness of still water. In a more personal sense, it signifies both the mental and internal disturbance that is akin to almost being physically sickened and disturbed. Then in that shortest verse in the Bible, we hear it. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Jesus has the same reaction that the mourners do. He weeps real tears. And so even the incarnate God is broken in his heart and soul by the death of his friend Lazarus. Death grieves God. So also does death break our hearts and stir up our souls. It is within this context that we tell the story of Jesus' offering life anew to his friend Lazarus. Death stinks and it stings. No perfume, pat answers, or Halloween costumes can remove this reality. Why does the scripture tell us that Jesus wept? Have you ever pondered that? Why does he cry and mourn if he knows that Lazarus will live again? If he knows that he has the very power to bring him back from the dead? I think it's because of death's enduring reality. The miracle of the story is that a smelly, dead man comes walking from the tomb at the simple command of Jesus' come out. This death for Lazarus is defeated. He will need to be cleaned up and to take off his grave clothes. But Lazarus gets a second shot at life again. And it's his friends who will have to get their hands dirty. It's they who will have to touch him and free him from death. And then such, they'll have to touch death itself. However, death is not forever defeated for Lazarus. He'll have to die again. This is not the resurrection of Jesus. It's only a temporary recovery from death for Lazarus. And this is why Jesus weeps. Because he knows that death is real. And that real life made known through real resurrection, has not yet been offered. Easter has not yet come. But we are an Easter people. We stand on the other side of a different death and resurrection, God's own, where life shifts from temporary to everlasting, and death becomes a mere shadow. So on this All Saints' Day, we remember two things. First, that death can no longer terrify us. Promised a share of Christ's own resurrection, we can even look death in the eye and not blink. For this reason, while we mourn the death of our loved ones, it's that reason we celebrate their triumph, their victory, as they now rest from their labors and live with Christ in glory. Second, and perhaps most importantly, life. Life no longer terrifies us either. For our whole life is now sanctified. All of it. Even the parts we don't want to admit to ourselves or anyone else. That all of it's made holy and given a purpose, and through God's promise to be with us and for us and to use us and all of our gifts to God's glory. Here, in fact, we perceive the true significance of this day that we remember, All Saints' Day, far more clearly. Saints are not only those persons in the Bible or church history who did great things, nor are saints only those who have died for the faith. Saints are not even only those who are of such great moral courage and kindness or discipline to set examples for the rest of us. Rather, saints are also, and I'd say especially, all of those who have been baptized into Christ. All of us. Our word saint comes from the Greek word which means holy ones, a word which itself comes from a Hebrew word meaning set apart for the Lord's use. In holy baptism, you see, each of us is set apart, consecrated, named and called and commissioned by God to be God's children, God's partners, God's co-workers in this world, the very people that God will use to achieve God's own will. And today we had 2 new saints when we baptized Connor and Selah. Simply because God sets us apart and calls us saints in baptism, we have God's promise that God will use us, our times, our talents, our treasures, and our abilities and our interests, our whole lives, to further God's own will. This not only gives our lives new meaning, but also conveys tremendous significance upon our daily routine and our roles as parent or spouse, MHA employee, citizen, teacher, volunteer, co-worker, friend, whatever any title you can think of. It becomes the very places where we take our stand as God's co-workers and partners to do literally holy work. Work that God has set apart and called holy because it is done by holy people. It's done by you. You see, in baptism, we do don a new costume. We put on new clothes. But it's not about putting on a Halloween mask, but rather about shedding our death rags like Lazarus. All Saints' Day, then, is our day as we perceive ourselves to be those persons whom God has set apart to do God's work in this world, those whom God has promised to accompany through all our living and all our dying unto new life, and those who are joined to all the faithful who have lived, labored, and died in the faith before us, the community of saints. And so we direct our gaze vertically to give thanks for those who have departed for us from a time and now live into God's fullness, those who modeled for us God's love in the world because they loved us and are now part of the great cloud of witnesses cheering us on from the next. And then we can take our gaze and direct it horizontally to all of our saints present here today, all of our callings here and now. We can hear God's call to seek and serve Christ in all persons and get back to work in our daily lives, that we know God's own beloved and capable saints, all those people God called us to be. It's in baptism that we find that reality. As we renew our baptismal covenant and we usher 2 people into the household of God as saints today, may you remember that you too are a saint of God, called to holy work. Amen.